So you finally finished up your mix. Your song sounds balanced, clean, the vocals are up front, the drums are hitting hard, everything is the way that you want it to be, and you're ready for the last stage, mastering. And chances are, if you clicked on this video, you might be wondering, what is mastering? Well, today I'm not only gonna show you what mastering is, but I'm gonna show you the steps that you can take to start mastering your own music in the comfort of your own home studio. So let's hop right in and get to it. All right, so first off, let's just define what mastering is. Mastering is simply the process of polishing your song so that it sounds cohesive and loud enough to meet industry standards. Really, the goal of mastering is to ensure that your song is gonna sound good when played back on any speaker or any media device. And it's very important for you to understand what the difference is between mixing and mastering. Mixing is where you have complete control over each sound and each instrument within your song. If you wanted to change the volume on just the snare drum, or you wanted to add an EQ to the hi-hats, you have the ability to do all this within the mixing stage. But with mastering, you're gonna be working with the whole entire mix, where everything is brought together to form one piece of audio. So it's very critical for you to understand that any change you make during the mastering process, it's gonna have an effect on your whole entire mix, because you're dealing with one piece of audio instead of having access to the individual tracks within your mix. And that's why the majority of your sound is gonna be crafted during the mixing stage, whereas the mastering stage is more so where you're just gonna be making small final adjustments, gluing everything together, and really just taking your song to the next level. Okay, so now that you have a basic understanding of what mastering is, let's go ahead and hop into FL Studio here. I'm gonna play a snippet of the song that we're gonna be mastering today. It's a song that I wrote and recorded myself. And while you're taking a listen, I want y'all to pay attention to the meter over here on the left side. And you're gonna notice that my mix, before any mastering is taking place, my mix is gonna be peaking at -9 to -6 decibels.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind, and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am. And I've been tracing my steps, trying to pick up what's left. Now I'm caught up in the midst.
Okay, so as y'all saw, my mix was peaking at -9 to -6 decibels right there. And that's really the sweet spot as far as where I want my mix peaking at before any mastering is taking place. You could even get up to -3 decibels, but the point is you just want to leave yourself some space or headroom away from 0 decibels. You don't want to have to worry about going above 0 decibels and creating any type of clipping effect when you are mastering, right? Because during the mastering phase, you're going to be adding some effects, some processing. You might be boosting with an EQ. So you just want to leave yourself a little bit of room away from 0 decibels. Now, the first thing we're going to do to master this song is we're going to use an EQ plugin to shape the overall tonality of our track. As a beginner, you can use any EQ plugin that you'd like. In this tutorial, I'm going to be using the Ozone 9 EQ made by Isotope, but all of the EQ plugins are going to have the same basic settings and controls on them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do with this EQ is we are going to grab this EQ point right here, and we're going to apply a gentle boost in the mid-range of our frequency spectrum. So somewhere around 2000 hertz. This is where a lot of the vocal and some of the instruments sit at as far as the frequency spectrum. And if you'll notice, I'm only boosting by about a half decibel. And the reason that I'm not really boosting by a lot is because mastering is all about, you know, making a lot of small moves that add up to really just fully enhance the sound of the song, right? We don't want to make drastic changes to our song during the mastering phase. A lot of that can be handled while you're mixing the song. Mastering, again, you don't want to make big changes because it's going to have too much of an impact on all of the sounds within your mix. Something else to point out is that the Q value on this bell curve is set for the curve to be very wide. You don't want to have a very sharp Q value, because then you're going to really hear that you're boosting right there at 2000 hertz. And that can begin to start sounding harsh to the human ear. So just, again, make sure that you have a very low Q value set. I like to keep mine at around 1. Now, the next thing we're going to do with this EQ is we are going to apply a high shelf curve to the higher frequencies in our song, so that way we can add some brightness and sparkle to the top end of our mix. So I'll take this EQ point right here and change it to high shelf. Really the trick here is that you want to make sure you're not boosting too low on the frequency spectrum. So like right now it's at 8,000 hertz. You'll tend to get some harshness down here. So I like to make sure that I have this set at around probably 14,000 hertz and above. And again, you'll see that I'm only boosting by like 0.7 decibels, right? So you don't want to overdo this, especially in the top end, because you'll get too much brightness and it's just gonna really sound harsh on the ears. I'm gonna go ahead and press play and just kind of experiment with this high shelf curve so that way you can really hear what it's doing to our song.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am.
Okay, so as y'all saw right there, I aggressively boosted the top end with the high shelf curve just so you could get a feel for what it was doing. And then I pulled it back down a bit to just add a gentle amount of sheen to the top end of our mix. The last thing we're gonna do with this EQ plugin is we are going to apply a high pass filter to the extreme low end of our mix. So anything below about 20 hertz, 30 hertz, a lot of that is just low end rumble that kind of oftentimes builds up and can kind of muddy up our mix. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this high pass filter at about 25 hertz. Something that's worth pointing out is that our slope on this high pass filter is set at 6 dB per octave, right? So this is a very forgiving and gentle slope as far as a high pass filter goes. You wouldn't want to increase this slope too much to make an aggressive cut down here because it's gonna kind of build some resonant frequency up right there at the high pass filter. And you don't wanna remove too many of the low end frequencies, right? So we want a very gentle slope. So I'm gonna go ahead and set that back at 6 decibels per octave. Some studio monitors and speakers really can't even reproduce or play back these extreme lower frequencies down here in the 20 hertz range. So I would suggest if you can't hear what's going on down here and how this high pass filter is affecting your master, then I would just leave it out altogether and not even apply a high pass filter to your song. It's an optional step that you don't necessarily have to do. It really all depends on the overall mix of your song. Let's go ahead and press play again, and I'm gonna bypass the EQ on and off so that way you can hear the difference.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am. And I've been tracing my steps, trying to pick up what's left. Now I'm caught.
Okay, so there wasn't a huge difference, but that's okay. We're not looking to make these drastic changes to our song. To my ears, it just sounded a little bit more open and a little more bright when I had the EQ turned on and engaged. And that's what we're aiming to do. All these small changes are gonna stack up over the mastering process to make our song sound more polished and smooth. The next thing we're gonna do to master our song is we are going to add some control to our mix. There are gonna be some frequency buildups that occur when all of these different instruments and vocals and sounds that are all sharing the same frequencies are coming together as one. Certain frequency ranges are gonna sound very harsh and jarring to the ear, and that's gonna be something that we're gonna try to fix during this mastering process. And we're gonna use what's called a dynamic EQ in order to do this. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a dynamic EQ is, I want you to just think about how a regular EQ works. A regular EQ gives you the ability to, turn down certain frequencies. So let's say if I wanted to turn down 250 hertz on a regular EQ, I would just grab an EQ point, set it at 250 hertz, and then I would just turn down the gain a few dB or so to kind of control that certain frequency. Now, the problem with that in regards to mastering is that it's going to have that frequency turned down throughout the whole entire song, regardless of how loud that certain frequency range is. And sometimes a frequency is only really loud and jarring to the ear at certain times during the song. I mean, you're gonna have chord changes, you're gonna have instruments coming in and out, vocals, drums, frequency loudness is always changing. So in order to control my frequency spectrum in an efficient way, I'm going to use a dynamic EQ. And what a dynamic EQ allows me to do is set a loudness threshold for each frequency point that I'm trying to control. So the frequency is only going to get turned down when it exceeds or gets louder than the loudness threshold that I set for that specific frequency. So I'm going to be using the Ozone 9 dynamic EQ made by Isotope, but again, you can use any EQ that you'd like that has dynamic EQ capabilities. Let's go ahead and take this EQ point right here. And the really cool thing that I like about this dynamic EQ right here is that you have the ability to solo any frequency point. So this is really going to help me sweep around the frequency spectrum and find which frequencies are standing out to my ear. Let's go ahead and press play and kind of take a listen and try to find a frequency that we want to turn down and control. Okay, so right there at about 3000 hertz, you could hear the snare drum, a little bit of the hi-hat and the vocal kind of clashing right there. And so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna kind of bring that back a little bit to establish some type of control right there, so that way it's not so harsh on the ears. So I'm just gonna pull back on our gain knob right here to about -4 decibels. Keep in mind that this isn't telling the dynamic EQ to actually remove 4 decibels from this specific frequency. What it's actually doing is kind of acting as the maximum amount of decibels that you can remove from that frequency. So how much we actually remove is going to be determined by our loudness threshold setting. This threshold setting right here is going to act like a threshold setting that you would find on any compressor plugin. So the lower we bring this threshold down, the more and more gain reduction we're going to get. But keep in mind, we're only getting gain reduction right here at this specific frequency. Something worth pointing out is that our Q value right here, if you had this set too wide, you're going to be removing too many of the frequencies to the left and to the right of the actual frequency that we're trying to remove. And you want to be very surgical when you're doing reductive EQ. So make sure to have your Q value set at about 3 or 4. That's going to be a good starting spot, and you can adjust that as necessary. Let's go ahead and press play and just lower this threshold setting and kind of experiment with getting some gain reduction right there to provide some control right there at about 3000 hertz.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind and it seems that
Okay, so as y'all heard, I brought that threshold setting down quite a bit, and I started to lose a lot of the power from the snare drum. And so I brought that threshold setting back up to where I was just getting a subtle amount of gain reduction to provide some control right there at about 3000 hertz. Let's go ahead and grab this next EQ point right here, and we're gonna solo it, do the same thing. We're gonna sweep around, try to identify any other frequencies that are standing out to our ear. Okay, so right there at about 500 hertz, I started to hear the vocals sound a bit muddy. It's really competing with other instruments right there in the low mids. So what we're gonna do is pull that back a little bit to kind of make that stick out a little bit less. Again, I'm gonna set the gain at about -4 decibels. I'm gonna tighten up the Q value, and then I'm going to press play and lower this threshold.
For some time I fell behind and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am.
Okay, so that's sounding pretty good. Let's go ahead and grab this next EQ point and continue on with this process. I'm expecting to hear something at about 200 to 250 hertz. Usually, you know, down here where these lower frequencies are, there's a tendency to have a lot of power build up with all the kick drum and the lower end of some of these instruments. So let's go ahead and just solo this frequency set point and see what we got. Okay, so right there at about 200 hertz, it felt like the kick drum was just a little bit too powerful and was standing out a bit too much. And I know that's kind of weird to say because, you know, we're always trying to get our drums to hit harder. But right there at that specific frequency, I felt like it could be a little bit too much for a set of like smaller speakers or headphones to handle. And that's really what mastering is about, is trying to make our song, you know, again, sound good being played back on any media device. So let's go ahead and try to clean that up just a little bit.
Lost track of who I am. I've been tracing my steps.
Okay, so I didn't remove too much from the kick drum right there, just enough to kind of tighten up the low end of our master. And you'll notice that on the Q value, I have it set a little bit wider than some of these other EQ points. And the reason that I did that is because when I soloed this EQ point and I was sweeping around to find which frequency I wanted to remove, I was noticing that a lot of the frequencies to the left and to the right of 200 hertz were also having some buildup. So by having a wider Q value set, I'm kind of taming some of those frequencies as well with this EQ point. But again, none of these EQ points are taking away too much from the song, right? They're only there to provide some control. Okay, so the next step in our mastering stage is we want to add some character to our song. And the best way to do this is gonna be to add some subtle amounts of saturation or harmonic distortion to our master. This is gonna add some color and really just warm things up and add a little bit of analog vibe to our song. Sometimes in the digital realm of making music, our mixes can just be too clean and transparent in a sense. So if you want to add some more excitement to your track, this is going to be the perfect way to do it. This is the vintage AX exciter made by Waves. If you're interested in this plugin, I'll leave a link in the description. But the reason I really love this plugin is because of the simplicity of it. There's really not that many knobs on this plugin, so it's going to help you kind of dial in the perfect amount of excitement and analog character to your mix. You have the main mix knob right here in the middle of the plugin, and this is just going to control how much excitement you add into your song. And really, that's the only knob that I mess with. So I'm gonna go ahead and press play and just slowly blend in this knob until we start to really hear the effect, and then I'll pull it back a little bit.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind, and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am. I've been tracing my steps.
Okay, so to my ears, the song is sounding a little bit more full and complete with these added harmonics. And it's not a very huge difference, but it's very subtle. And that's what I like about, you know, dialing in the perfect amount of each effect. The next thing we want to do as far as mastering goes is we want to bring the overall loudness of our song up to a point to where it's loud enough to compete with other songs in the industry. And in order to do this, we're going to use what's called a limiter. A limiter is going to prevent anything from going above 0 decibels. So as we bring the volume up and approach that ceiling of 0 decibels, the limiter is going to chop off any peaks in audio that are trying to go above that ceiling. Now, you may think that that sounds a little counterintuitive, right? Like when you're talking about music and audio, why would you want to chop anything off? But in order to bring up the loudness of the whole entire song, you have to sacrifice some of those loud peaks in audio. I'm going to be using the Ozone 9 Maximizer made by Isotope, but again, you can use any limiter plugin that you'd like. They're all going to have the same settings and controls on them, so just try to follow along and understand the concepts, and you should be fine as far as trying to bring up the overall loudness of your song. Now, as I said, you don't want to go above 0 decibels because then you're going to get clipping and distortion. So this ceiling setting right here is where you're going to set the maximum amount of output level. So the ceiling setting is where you're going to tell the limiter, don't let any audio go above this point, or else we're going to chop off the peaks of audio that try to go above that point. So I like to set my ceiling at about -0.3. And the reason that I like to do this is because, things in the digital realm often aren't perfect. So I just want to kind of ensure and give myself a little bit of space away from 0 decibels. So that way, if anything does make it through the ceiling, it's not going to actually go above 0 decibels. It's only going to go above -0.3. This is where I've always set my ceiling, and I've gotten good results from it. Next, we just want to play one of the louder sections of our song. And as we lower this threshold knob right here, it's going to bring the gain or the volume up. And as we approach this ceiling of -0.3 decibels, we're going to start to get some gain reduction or some limiting occurring where the limiter is chopping off those peaks in audio. Down here at the bottom of this meter, it's going to tell us how much gain reduction or limiting we're getting. And I typically like to stay between 3 to 5 decibels of gain reduction. And depending on which limiter that you're using, if you go more than 5 decibels of gain reduction, you'll start to get some audible artifacts from the limiter that are not very pleasing to the ear. So you're going to want to avoid those. But typically 3 to 5 decibels is a good sweet spot to kind of aim for. Up here, we can select the true peak setting, and this option just kind of ensures that the limiter will try its best to make sure that nothing is going to get past the ceiling that we have set here. So let's go ahead and press play and lower this threshold to get some gain reduction. And do keep in mind that the song is going to get louder and louder as I lower this threshold. So you might want to turn the volume on whatever device you're listening back on. Turn it down a little bit.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind, and it seems that I may have lost track of who I am. And I've been tricked.
Okay, so that's sounding pretty good right there. And a good trick that I have for y'all is if you're using a different limiter or you just kind of want to test how much you can push the limiter, lower that threshold setting as much as you can until you start to hear a pumping effect where you really hear the limiter acting upon those peaks of audio, and it's turning it down a little bit too much, and then back off on that threshold setting a bit. And that's where you're gonna find the sweet spot for your limiter. Another thing that we need to do before exporting our song is we need to apply some form of dithering to our audio. And without trying to get too technical and confusing, the best way to explain what dithering is doing is it's gonna add just a subtle amount of white noise to our song. You really won't be able to hear it, but it's there to basically cover up any artifacts that are created when you do bit depth reduction during the exporting process. Now, the cool thing that I like about the Ozone 9 Maximizer is that it has its own dither section here in the bottom right of the plugin. Not all limiters are going to have their own dithering section on them, but there are free ways to add dithering to your track. So in FL Studio on the export page, there's a dithering option there, and I'm sure whichever DAW you're going to be working in is going to have some type of dithering options available. So just do a little bit of research, but just keep in mind, anytime you're going to be doing any type of bit depth reduction, you need to add some type of dithering to your track. So here in FL Studio, we're working with 32-bit flow audio, but I want to export at 24-bit. So over here on the left side, I'm going to select 24-bit depth. The dither amount I set to low because I want to avoid it being very audible to the ear. And then I select limit peaks, and then I turn off the noise shaping. And again, dithering can be very confusing, so I'm not gonna explain all of the very intricate technicalities of it. I just wanted to introduce the basics of it so that way you're aware that you might need to add dithering to your final export. Now, you're gonna want to have some type of loudness meter to measure the overall loudness of your song. And the most useful metric for measuring loudness right now is gonna be a measurement called LUFS. So whichever loudness plugin you decide to use, make sure that it has the ability to measure in LUFS. This right here is the WLM loudness meter made by Waves. If you're interested in this plugin, I'll leave a link in the description so you can go check it out. So long story short, you just want to load this plugin at the very end of your mastering chain. And then up here at the top is the long-term LUFS measurement. That's really what we're concerned about. And I'm aiming from anywhere between -12 to -9 LUFS. So you just have to play the whole song through this plugin, and it's going to measure the overall loudness of your song throughout the entirety of the track. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to do that because that would take way too long, but just know that you want to know where your song is hitting at in terms of LUFS. So I'm going to just press play and you'll see how this plugin works.
I've been trying to find myself for some time. I fell behind and it seems that
now, if your song is not hitting where you want it to in terms of long-term LUFS, then go back to your limiter and bring that threshold setting a little bit lower and make the limiter work harder. And if that still doesn't work, then just leave a comment in the comment section and I'll give you some tips on how to make your master a little bit louder without having to use the limiter. Overall, if your song is too quiet, then it's going to sound a little bit out of place when compared to other songs that are out there in the world. And once you are satisfied with the loudness of your song, make sure to remove the loudness plugin from your mastering chain. We don't want to leave it on our mastering chain because it's not really doing anything processing wise. One thing to quickly discuss is the sample rate at which you want to do your final export for your master at. So I recommend doing either 48,000 or 44,100. These two are going to be the industry standard as far as sample rate goes. 48,000 is going to be a higher quality, so that's what I record at and that's what I export at. 48,000 is my recommendation. Now you can't really upsample to a higher quality at export, so if you recorded everything at 44,100, go ahead and do your final export at 44,100. But since I record all of my audio at 48,000, that's simply what I'm going to export at, so that way there's no sample rate reduction. Now we've made it to the point where we are ready to do the final export of our song. Every DAW is going to have a different way to do the final export of your song. Obviously, I'm in FL Studio, so I'll link a video in the description where I go over the best export settings for FL Studio. But if you're using another software, you've made it to this point, you should feel comfortable with the processing side of mastering as far as what you're trying to accomplish with each plugin. All right, so that's it for today. I hope y'all now have a better grasp on the concept of mastering and feel a little bit more confident about mastering your own music moving forward. Keep in mind that there are plenty of other things you can add into your mastering chain, but what I've taught in this video today are basically just the bare essentials that are going to help you get a clean and professional sounding master. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video.